get started. Welcome to talk number 2 this year, academic year, of Critical Thinkers in Religion, Law, and Social Theory. I see some faces I don't know, so I'll just tell you who I am. I'm Laurie Beeman. I hold the Canada Research Chair in the Contextualization of Religion in a Diverse Canada, and I wish I hadn't chosen that name for that chair. It was too long, but essentially the chair sponsors this series with some occasional help from various other sources of funding, and also the always help of my colleagues André Laliberté in the School of Political Studies, Pascal Fournier in law, Elke Winter in sociology, and Sonia Sika in philosophy. So we all collaborate to think about who we might bring to the University of Ottawa to share their wisdom and knowledge with us. I want to mention that already for next year, I think this is the last one for this year, although I'm not positive, but most of you are on our listserv, so I'll let you know if things change. But I can already tell you, I believe will be our first speaker this coming September, Robert Orsi from Northwestern University. He's coming on September the 28th, so the details are on our Religion and Diversity website, and for those of you who aren't on the list, if you want to be, you can talk to Tess Campo, who will probably put you on the listserv if you ask nicely. So without further ado, as you know, if those of you who come to this series regularly, I don't usually give long introductions to the speakers, but I will say a few words about Mary Jo because I know her as a friend, a colleague, and as a mentor. She's coming to us from the University of Missouri, and I have these little bio notes, and it's pretty brief. She's a professor emerita in fact, she hasn't really finished teaching yet. She's actually teaching this term, but she's in the Department of Women's and Gender Studies at the University of Missouri, and her PhD was from the University of Chicago. Her research areas are wide, including gender and religion, sociology of culture, qualitative methodologies. She's one of the best ethnographers I know, and she has a huge range of publications. One of them, I'm happy to say, is now in press in a volume that I've co-edited with Sonia Sika, a volume called A Journey to Elsewhere, or at least that's what it's called right now, Spiritual Travel and the Quest for Authenticity. And Mary Jo came last year, and we didn't let her out for that event. We just kept her in a sealed room, and we had a nice small workshop where we talked about a number of issues around yoga, tourism, spiritual travel, and so on and so forth. One of her articles that has shifted my thinking is Queering the Dragon Fest, Changing Sexualities in a Post-Patriarchal Religion in the journal Sociology of Religion. And I'll just add on a personal note that I'm trained as a sociologist, among other things, and there have been times when I've found sociology to be lacking in its ability to think about religion, or I felt really discouraged. And I have to say that almost every juncture that's happened, by some good fortune, I have encountered Mary Jo. Sometimes it's been to just hear her talk at a conference, and she's always reminded me of why I find one of my home disciplines so helpful and useful in thinking about religion. So, without further ado, the title of the talk today is Religion and Emotion, Advancing a New Framework for Understanding Religious Cultures. Thanks, Jo Neitz.
Well, thank you, Laurie. I'm really very thrilled to be here. This is my third trip to the University of Ottawa over the last decade, maybe, and it's always a treat. It's always a treat to be here. And I also want to thank Heather, who has been extremely helpful and pleasant and made my stay here so far a complete pleasure. And also Tess, who has added her skills and competencies to my visit at this point. The paper that I want to read to you today is co-authored with two of my former students, Karen Bradley and Kevin McElmurray, and they actually have done the ethnographic work that I'm using for the paper. So thank you, Karen and Kevin. The categories of analysis in the sociology of religion, as it developed in the United States in the 20th century, reflected the heritage of European scholars' interpretations of the Reformation's religious traditions. Carving out a place in a discipline with theorizing about modernity at its core, sociology of religion in the United States developed around conceptualizations that pitted rationality and belief against emotions and the body, and favored the former at the expense of the latter. Core concepts such as secularization developed around a project in which belief and lack of belief was central. At the same time, certain forms of expression, particularly those found in Pentecostal and holiness churches, were marked as emotional, with the inference being that the other forms of expression and religious traditions were not emotional. In his study of a black church in the U.S. South, Nelson, for example, struggles with these conventions, although he resists the characterization of churches like the Pentecostal one he studied as emotional, yet he adheres to the convention, putting the words emotional in quotation marks throughout his text. These forms were historically associated with marginal race and class locations, although departures were becoming increasingly visible by the 1970s. In suggesting that the field reframe how it conceptualizes emotion, we move away from this simple assumption, such as that emotional religion is most likely to find expression in lower class and African American congregations. We want to rethink emotional religion and to argue for exploring empirically how belief and emotion work together in particular religious traditions among particular people. This project is part of a current interest in understanding emotion as a part of social life within sociology more generally. Hochschild's pioneering work on feeling rules and emotion as work provided a way of seeing emotion as social. New work in social movements argues for rethinking the dichotomy between belief and emotion and for seeing commitment, solidarity, and belief as related. Scholars see the conceptual opposition of emotion and cognition as a barrier to a fuller understanding of personal transformation and identification and group processes within social movements. We are beginning to see questions raised about the processes through which emotion and embodiment are part of constructing or constituting religious belief and practices. For example, in his essay on why Christianity has endured, Chris Smith posits that the belief content gives rise to certain practices and experiences, particularly emotional ones, that many people find engaging and convincing. Furthermore, he argues that these feelings are central to the capacity of Christian beliefs to make faith compelling and believable. In another example, Robert Wethnow ended his 2006 Furphy lecture, Cognition and Religion, by pointing to the links between cognition and emotion in the experience of religious phenomena. Randall Collins has proposed that his theory of interaction rituals be applied to religion, and several scholars have taken up this call. This shift, no doubt, has many sources. We see the influence of feminist perspectives in Hochschild's important insight into the gendered nature of emotional work and the absence of emotion in sociological analysis as a way of rendering women's work invisible. Other feminists present an epistemology that argues for the relation between empathy and attachment and rationality. Another source is the development of interest in lived religion among historians of religion. Robert Orsi pushes his readers to understand how people he studies make religious worlds in encounters that are sensory and emotive, as well as cognitive. More generally, sociologists' discovery of narrative has increased awareness of the importance of storytelling in everyday life and the significance of narrative in social science explanations. Stories combine emotional and cognitive elements and remind us that as humans, we are not only persuaded by rational arguments, but we are also moved and persuaded when our emotions are evoked by a story, a song, or a piece of art. In another strand of inquiry in cultural studies, affect scholars, following Masumi's interpretation of Deleuze, call on us to recognize the significance of embodied experiences, although, to my disappointment, they write very little about religion. We propose that there's much to be gained by incorporating analysis of emotion more broadly into research in the sociology of religion. We take as a starting point the assumption that belief and emotion are co-constitutive in the constitution of religious experience. Sociologists of religion could ask about feeling rules specific to particular faith traditions and congregations. We could explore stories told about what happens in the setting in terms of emotion as well as belief, and we could seek to understand the cultural processes through which bodies, emotions, and cognitions are engaged in an experience that gets defined in particular contexts as religious. Scholars in many disciplines today are researching the ways that cognition and emotion are co-constitute. Their approaches differ somewhat depending on how the relation between emotion and cognition had been conceptualized in the dominant frames extant in their fields. Space limitations prohibit all but the most cursory review of this fascinating work. Starting with brain function, neurologists studying the biological basis of emotion have demonstrated the relation between rationality and emotion at that level. For some psychologists and social psychologists, the problem has been to show how emotions are culturally constructed. The economist Robert Frank, on the other hand, wanted to show how the decision-making of rational man is influenced by emotion. In sociology, Randall Collins, influenced by Durkheim and Goffman, has been pursuing the ideal that rational action is fueled by emotional energy. He's developed a theory explaining how micro-level interactions among co-present individuals become the basis of a shared mood and a mutual focus of attention, leading to collective effervescence and eventually to group solidarity. Collins is particularly interested in how macro structures of society are built from chains of interaction rituals occurring across time and space. His conceptualization of emotional entrainment suggests a series of factors that one might consider in trying to understand processes of commitment. All these researchers link emotion and cognition, but their arguments start and stop in different places. Is emotion itself is a term that means different things in different research traditions. We suggest that for sociologists of religion, a first step to seeing emotion across religious practices is to distinguish between arousal levels and emotion itself. Level of arousal might be considered as one dimension of an emotional expression, with low arousal not necessarily being the same as low emotion. Yogis, for example, might desire the feeling of peacefulness that is the ideal effect of shavasana, the corpse pose, often the culmination of a session of yoga practice. Most practitioners would argue that this low arousal state is in fact a significant emotional experience. In a comparative study, psychologists Tsai Miao and Sapala argued that Christianity and Buddhism place high values on different levels of arousal. They find a correspondence between the dominant religious cultures in each place, with the European Americans valuing high arousal positive states, in contrast to Hong Kong Chinese valuing low arousal states. That is not to say that Christianity is emotional and Buddhism is not. If we assume that emotion, cognition, and rationality are connected, and that most religions imagine an ideal emotion, although the ideal emotion might differ across religions, then we can better understand how different traditions or groups might have different norms about the range of acceptable emotions or the rules for expressing them. At Eastside Chapel in the U.S. South, Nelson found that people valued observable displays of the transformative effects of worship. Nelson described as normative 5 specific emotions evoked in the service through both the message and the hymns: adoration, love, hope, joy, gratitude. This congregation reads the ideal forms, including a responsive engagement with the sermon, and particular practices, especially shouting, with specific bodily movements as demonstrating the transformative presence of God. Our approach is explicitly cultural rather than social psychological, though we will end by raising some questions that link the two. We are interested in variation in desired emotions across religious contexts and the technologies through which it is produced. Our focus is not primarily on what people actually feel. We do not assume that everyone in a setting feels the same thing, or that a cultural production always achieves the desired effect. Those are empirical questions beyond the scope of our project. Our interest here is in bringing into view the activities and intentions of religious groups in engaging and even organizing emotion. I'm turning to 2 examples from 2 very different fieldwork projects by my co-authors. The first is a study of the challenges and opportunities facing rural congregations from 6 socioeconomic contexts. Faith Ministries, a small Pentecostal congregation in the Ozark region of southern Missouri, with a congregation of working class and poor white people, fits many of the stereotypes of emotional religion. Poor people shout and dance with joy in the presence of the Lord. We compare it with River Chapel, the largest congregation in a small Midwestern city, chosen as a site to study the use of music and popular culture forms